As I'm looking at the landscape, I can't help but notice a disgustingly low amount of alien talk, especially when it comes to that of the Lovecraft mythos. But we're gonna start off here. The umbral star, aka Velber, that comes to us in the Fate Extella timelines. So given its mural design, we know that Velber is an alien entity that takes the form of an eye. It directs itself across space looking for different places to pillage information from. In the meantime, it destroys pretty much every civilization that it comes in contact with, takes their data, and then rides back off into space looking for more places to invade. Sounds like a real douche if we're just going by that. The good news is it only swings by our galaxy every 14,000 years. The bad news is, well, this is the bad news. As of Extella, Velber is now making its rounds again to the Milky Way. By normal standards, this wouldn't be nearly that bad. But of course, we always have that one person that's there to make things 10 times worse. You'll never guess where they're from. Greece. Because you can't spell tragedy without Greece. That being our main antagonist, the well-known mathematician, engineer, and scientist, Archimedes. Now you might be thinking, Archimedes, he was such a progressive mind. What possibly could have went wrong? Yeah, it turns out Archimedes could care less about humanity. He was so infatuated with his progression of knowledge that he's willing to sacrifice humanity because of it. So what does this have to do with Velber? One thing to point out about Velber is that it gets even more complex in terms of design. Around its core, it has these layers in the form of arcs. They're called arcs of the stars, and each one is meant to not only defend Velber, but invade the locations that it chooses to take from. Arc number 1 and arc number 3 still remain unnamed. They're the older brother and the younger sister respectively. And then you have the second arc. The one that we deal with just so happens to be the arc that Velber shot off into the moon cell. So arc number 2 lodges itself into the moon, and the moon, being this intelligent system that it is, tries to ward it off. By the way, Velber is hinted to be made by the same aliens that made this grand supercomputer that's already in the moon cell. So they're really no different from us. Though they come from the same background, they still end up vying for their own independence against each other. It's not like Velber forgot where it came from. Its entire identity is to go throughout the universe and pillage all this information. At the same time, it's very possible that Velber now feels superior with all this information, and now wants to get a piece of ours too. So you got these two advanced systems going against each other, competing for space. Either way, arc number 2 is beating the moon cell's ass, dominating 80% of its defense systems. You have to think how technologically advanced the moon cell is, and here you have it still showing us its vulnerability. So it's beating the moon cell, and you know what that means. Since the Earth and the moon are more directly tied to each other by the time of Extra, it also means that the arc is starting to dominate Earth as well. This circles back around to the legendary event that I always bring back up, the invasion of the White Titan Sefar, where you had Sefar invade Earth and destroy 80% of its surface, getting rid of most of the civilizations 14,000 years ago back on its last journey. This was back in 12,000 BC. This event plays into a lot of different perspectives. We talked about this before in my FGO Olympian video, where the machine gods of LB5, namely Zeus, merged with the rest of the pantheon in order to beat Sefar during his time, and that's how he maintained control of his divergence. Now there's no real way to identify which one of them was written first. LB5 could have been written a while back for all we know, but we do know that Extella was released first back in 2016. So the idea is that the narrative comes from Extella and then it gets revisited in the FGO timelines in chapters like Lost Belt 5 and Lost Belt 6, for example. But keeping on that same notion, the moon cell is aware of what happened 12,000 years ago, so it's out here panicking, and with only 20% of its defenses left, it goes into emergency mode and manages to seal off the Ark's data in a location called the Zero Dark. The Zero Dark is basically a remote area that has no influence. It's like a void space, and it's actually meant to be the equivalent to chaos, the same primordial chaos that existed before the world started to take form. This is the moon cell's version of that. So the moon cell seals off its communications, and it left the Ark in a perpetual state where it can't be reached. But guess what happens? Archimedes, being the pursuer of progress that he is, can't help but wonder, what if the Ark continued to drill its way into the moon? Now remember that I said that Sefar was defeated by an unnamed Excalibur wielder back in 12,000 BC. Each being that comes out of these arcs are coined as anti-cells. The one that came out of Arc 2 was Sefar. The body that the anti-cell Sefar had on Earth ended up just being buried as a corpse. This is the big white giant that you often see in the pictures. But the body of the anti-cell on the moon is what the moon sealed in the Zero Dark. The thing about that is, the cell had redesigned itself to match the frame of someone from the land that it ravaged. And given the fate interpretation of her background, it took on the form of Altera, becoming Titan Altera. This is who ended up being sealed in the Zero Dark, Altera and her respective arc. And she's been asleep all of this time, 14,000 years since the last invasion. Archimedes, given his background, had been summoned to work for the moon cell as an engineer. The fact that it picked him out of everybody is actually super impressive. It's a shame what he decided to do with it. This is where the main character Hakuno decides to come in. In Extella, it recognizes Hakuno as the winner of the Extra War, the story before Extella, and rewards him with the ring known as the Regalia. The ring itself acts as a resistance against Sefar, and the only people that can destroy it are Sefar or its wielder. Long story short, Archimedes realized that if he can manage to destroy the ring, it will allow Sefar to continue her pursuit. So he tricks us at the beginning of the story into going into the Zero Dark, knowing Sefar would get rid of both us and the ring. Except she doesn't. Beyond her taking on the form of Altera from our planet, she also gained a conscience with it. And she realized that she wasn't really a fan of the whole world domination thing, as she was originally intended. If she leaves the cave, then she'll lose this conscience and go back to her original state of mind, which was meant to conquer. If she stays in the cave, then she has no way to interact with the outside. So in her Titan form, she's kind of stuck. Luckily, she has so much power that she can create an Earth-sized vessel that isn't confined to these types of restrictions. This is known as Hero Altera. So ultimately, that's what happens. We go out to fight with Hero Altera. We discover through multiple routes what Archimedes was really up to, and then we go off to deal with him. Behind the scenes, Archimedes ended up getting contaminated by the cells that came from Arc 2. These were the void cells. As you can see on his body, they give him this purple and yellow S design, turning him into one of her servants. But you can't really even feel sorry for him at this point, because this is what he wanted anyway, whether he truly was in control by this point or not. So the moment that we snuff him out, he uses Titan Altera to awaken the true form of Sefar in the moon cell, and she tries to destroy us. This is the design that was on the thumbnail, the big white giant with the huge hands and the white and blue color scheme. We defeat her, but this man doesn't quit. In a last-ditch effort, he tries to throw the entire arc at us outright, which would also mean our destruction. At this point in the story, we regain the full form of the Regalia, which had been divided up into pieces at the start because of the narrative. This unfortunately meant that Altera, in her hero form, couldn't be around any longer, but she does lend us her Sword of Mars, one of the greatest swords in the franchise. If you've been through FGO, you'll know its impact from before when we summon Ares. Nero starts to become one with the sword, turning into one of her strongest variants that we've seen yet. And this was before the introduction of her beast class. And she begins to harness the Roman power, specifically from the goddess Venus, to become Saber Venus. Nero blows up the Ark, Altera creates a baby version of herself, and we all live on happily ever after. And Archimedes somehow survives. That can be good. And this leads us over into Extella Link, though his Link version of him is different from the one that we went up against. Go figure.